welcome to my panel and audience. Thank you. I'm Celeste Langen, and I'm welcoming you here on behalf of the Townsend Humanities Center and the UC Consortium of Humanities Centers. I'd like to welcome you to this workshop on work, or in the language of acronyms, WOW. Okay, so David, did you want to say a few words about the initiative on the humanities and changing conceptions of work?
Yes, thanks very much, Celeste. It's a pleasure to see you all here, and thanks so much for agreeing to do this workshop collectively. The workshop on work and the larger project into which it plugs is a function of a grant. We were able to secure a fairly handsome 3-year grant from the Mellon Foundation in support of a general set of projects which provides funding like workshop funding, graduate seminar funding, and a range of other activities you can find on the websites of the UC Humanities Network as well as UCHRI to support rethinking current conceptions of work in the wake of and perhaps under the duress of changing economic, political, and indeed cultural conditions, and what the humanities can bring to understanding these changing conceptions of work, and indeed how, in turn, these transforming conceptions of work redound back on us in the humanities to think of the conditions of work in the humanities and the kind of things we might be teaching, particularly at the undergraduate level, but maybe also at the graduate level, to prepare students who are trained by us in the humanities for the transforming job market and the impact of technology on these transforming conceptions of work. So there's an upcoming immediate deadline at the end of this month, October 27th, for funding for workshops on work, WOW, as Les said, and to think very broadly, not just contemporarily about changing conceptions of work, but about the history of labor, the history of work conditions, how we, how different periods have considered and engaged working conditions, the sociological and contemporary impacts, and so on and so forth. I think back almost 30 years now to William Julius Wilson's now, in retrospect, rather prescient book called When Work Disappears. And he was, of course, thinking about the disappearance of work in relation to African-American young folk in particular, and what produces it and the impact on lives generally. But that condition has become, if we look at the Wall Street protests today, much more generic and much more widespread, indeed, not only within the context of the US, but internationally. And it's exactly that larger set of conditions dating back a very long time that we have in mind in thinking about the nature of work and the impact on work, on what it is to be human, on dignity, and so on. So it's a great pleasure to be able to host this webinar for the UC Humanities Network, which is itself is a fairly new network of UC Humanities Research Institute, of all the 10 humanities centers based on each of the campuses, the Society of Fellows, and so on. And to thank both the Townsend Center, Celeste Langen, Teresa Stoikov, and Andrew Viermet for the hard work in doing this, as well as staff from UCHRI, Jennifer Langdon and Sudhir Nakano, who are with you. And I look forward to a really interesting and engaging webinar as the first intervention on the basis of WOW. Thanks.
Great. Okay.
I will listen intently and with interest to the rest of
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much, David. And thank you for being instrumental in bringing the 3-year Mellon funded program to us. It seems to me that it's a wonderful and above all timely opportunity for UC faculty and scholars to consider the category, practice, and function of knowledge work. Scholarly interest in these issues has been reinvigorated and affected by the threatened status of public universities and common knowledge, even research and pedagogy not explicitly focused on the work of art and scholarship has been affected by awareness of the precarious status of academic labor in particular. In order to bring into focus the wide range of possibilities for rethinking the relation of the humanities to other forms of work, I've invited an extraordinary panel of UC scholars, half from Berkeley, half from our neighbor campuses, and I thank them in particular for having come on a rainy day. I have not invited them here to propose specific working groups, but rather to speak about how their own scholarly interests might bear on the question of the humanities and changing conceptions of work. The multi-campus representation here today is, to my mind, the most important dimension of today's program and constitutes its raison d'etre. The proposal for working groups requires that working groups be comprised of faculty and scholars from more than one campus. This is a good idea, but a potential obstacle for faculty who tend to know best only the scholars at other UCs already engaged in similar research. Since the goal of the working groups will be best served, I think, if they actually create new cross-disciplinary and cross-campus networks, it's my hope that today's event will help generate the knowledge of other relevant work. It's also true that most of our panelists today focus on changing conceptions of work in the 20th century. I assure you this is an accident, however, and I hope that scholars with interests in the deep history of work will make sure to contribute to the discussion as well. Although it's by no means a requirement of the initiative, I think it would be quite productive for every working group to have one representative on the working group of the deep history of work. So I wanted to be brief in order to allow panelists and discussants adequate time for conversation. Therefore, I'll offer only sketchy introductions for you. Our first speaker is Vincanne Adams, the professor of anthropology, history, and social medicine at UC San Francisco, where she's been since 2000, having previously taught at Princeton, and she did her graduate work here at Berkeley. She's the author and editor of several books, most recently Medicine Between Science and Religion, Sex in Development, Science, Sexuality, and Morality in Global Perspective, and Doctors for Democracy, Health Professionals in the Nepal Revolution, and her first book was Tigers of the Snow and Other Virtual Sherpas. She studies health and science in international and post-colonial contexts with particular interest in disaster economics and recovery. And today we'll be talking especially about the idea of volunteer labor. And I definitely am grateful for Vincanne because it seems to me healthcare work is such a burgeoning and problematic field that we need to bring that into the conversation. Our second speaker is Julia Bryan-Wilson, who has only been in residence on the Berkeley campus since the beginning of this semester, and this is the second time I've called upon her to participate in Townsend Center events. So kudos, history of art, good hire. Julia did her PhD here, but previously taught at UC Irvine and the Rhode Island School of Design. Her book, Art Workers, Radical Practice in the Vietnam War Era, was published in 2009. She's especially committed to questions of artistic labor in the 20th century, as well as to feminist, queer, and collaborative art, and is currently working on a new book under the contract at UChicago entitled Crafting Dissent, Handmade Work and Activism Since 1970, a book that we hope will think about network in relation to knitting. Joshua Clover, our third speaker, is the Associate Professor of English Literature and Critical Theory at UC Davis, a prolific writer of poetry, film, and music criticism. That is poetry and film and music criticism. I would call him the hardest working person I know, except that he confutes distinctions between work and its other, whatever that might be, leisure, play, pleasure, entertainment. He's the author of 2 highly regarded books of poetry, Madonna Anno Domini in 1997 and The Totality for Kids in 2000. In the 2000s. His film criticism includes a book on The Matrix, closely linked in his analysis to the important film Office Space, and the monthly column Marx and Coca-Cola for Film Quarterly. His avatar, Jane Dark, has written music criticism for The Village Voice and the blogosphere, but Joshua himself is the author of 1989, Bob Dylan Didn't Have This to Sing About, published by UC Press in 2009. For The Nation, he has written a series of reviews of books on the recent financial crisis, which is connected to his latest project, working title The Transformation Problem, which concerns poetry, crisis, and imperial transfer. Shannon Jackson, Goldman professor, I think that's still your title, right? Goldman professor in theater, dance, and performance studies and rhetoric, currently serves as chair of the Arts Research Center. She is the author, most recently, of Social Works, Performing Arts, Supporting Publics, published this year. Earlier prize-winning books include Professing Performance, Theater in the Academy from Philology to Performativity in 2004, and Lines of Activity, Performance, Historiography, and Hull House Domesticity in 2000. Steve Mckay is Associate Professor of Sociology at UC Santa Cruz, where he is also Director of the Center for Labor Studies. There, it's housed under the humanities. His research focus is on labor and global change, with a particular emphasis on Southeast Asia. He is the author of the 2006 book, Satanic Mills or Silicon Islands, The Politics of High-Tech Production in the Philippines, and articles on gender and work like Filipino Seamen Constructing Masculinities in an Ethnic Labor Niche, and Hard Drives and Glass Ceilings, Gender Stratification in High-Tech Production. He took his undergraduate degree at Berkeley. Richard Walker, professor of geography here at Berkeley, is the author of 4 books, beginning with The Capitalist Imperative, Territory, Technology, and Industrial Growth in 1989, The New Social Economy, Reworking the Division of Labor in 1992, The Conquest of Bread, 150 Years of California Agribusiness in some date that is incorrect. What year was it? Do you remember, Dick?
2004.
2004. I had 224. I knew that wasn't right. Speaking of the deep history of work.
More people working
and
in early
recently, The Country in the City, The Greening of San Francisco in 2007. More recently, he's also been at the forefront of scholars considering California as what he calls the pivot of the Great Recession, and in particular, the effects of crisis capitalism on the university. Okay, with that, I will turn it over to our first speaker, Vincanne Adams. No, you can sit there, that's fine. Unless you find it easier.
Yeah.
Do you want someone else to click in?
I can reach the clicking. Okay, do I need this? Okay. I want to thank Celeste and the Center and David. It's nice to see you again. I really wasn't sure what I was being called to do here, and I feel a little bit like I'm probably the latecomer to this topic. So fortunately, I had a talk that I gave last year, and I figured out a way to condense it into 10 minutes. Great. So I seem overprepared, but I'm actually underprepared on the topic, I would say. But I'm going to take you through how I got to the topic of volunteer or unpaid labor. Okay, so I was invited to participate in a 5-year study of post-Katrina New Orleans, where I interviewed 180 people over a 4-year period many times, and documented their experiences of recovery. And the result of that is a book that's now under contract with Duke University Press called Markets of Sorrow, Labors of Faith. And so I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about how that book came about. Is it up? Yeah. Okay, so you all know about the flooding, well, the hurricane and the subsequent collapse of the levee system that led to flooding in New Orleans in 2005. You know, the devastation was vast. Well, the first thing that I learned in starting to talk to people about this and do some investigation is something that a lot of other books are coming out on now, which is that the events took place because of a particular relationship between government subcontractors and the Army Corps of Engineers, the stuff that Naomi Klein talks about, the revolving door between subcontractors and government that led to a collapse of public institutions that were oriented towards safety of the public, toward profit-seeking ventures in and around the Gulf, around the oil industry, but also in the Middle East. I followed this up with the period right after the floods, the rescue and relief efforts, which were also organized by the same subcontractors, notably the Shaw Group, Bechtel, Halliburton, KBR, Titan, HBR, some of you know about these, and the big firm Blackwater Security, which is now called XE Services, organized by Eric Prince, our lead mercenary group in the US. And of course, these folks were called in to do the rescue and recovery. And what I document in my book is how these same subcontracting processes that were organized to actually cause the disaster and then to provide the relief in the aftermath of the disaster were also paid to come in and help do recovery in the period afterward. Halliburton and Bechtel were again subcontracted to provide the trailers that FEMA gave to people. And what I found is that people were living in these trailers for many, many years. The recovery was just seeming to take forever. I started interviewing in early 2007, and by 2009 and 2011, there were still many people who were in their trailers, many of whom had just given up on being able to return to their homes altogether. I'm skipping over a lot of stuff that I look at in the book having to do with race and class and other things. But one of the major programs that was designed to help people recover was a federal program where money was given to the Louisiana Recovery Authority, and which was spent on a program called the Road Home Program, which was meant to give people funding to fill in the gap between what insurance paid and what their home was assessed at. And of course, we all know insurance hardly paid anything to people because they blamed the disaster on floods, and people who didn't have flood insurance weren't able to collect on their insurance. Only people who had flood insurance got anything. Minor amounts were given out to people from storm damage. But this was, of course, exactly the opposite of what the government claimed when it said that the storms were actually the cause of the flooding. So there was an interesting slippage going on there. So over the 5-year period, there were lots of problems with people being able to get funding to return. And pretty soon small organizations started to emerge that were trying to help people get money from the Road Home Program. One of the reasons that I documented there was a problem with the Road Home Program is that it was subcontracted to a company that was a for-profit company called ICF International. ICF designed the program for recovery aid and then was given the no-bid government contract for this program in the immediate aftermath. And within 2 months of their getting the contract, their stock went up before they even gave out a penny of relief to people. So one of the big stories here is how these subcontracting processes produced inefficiencies of profit that led to the delays over a 4-year period. While people were still living in their trailers, and these were really like internment camps. Many of them were hours outside of the city, with chain link fence around them, no transportation to the city. And even at the period of time, 4 years after the floods, while ICF was giving bonuses to its executives in the amounts of $2 million, FEMA started to tell people they had to vacate their trailers and offered that they could buy them for $25,000. And it turns out Halliburton and Bechtel were paid $229,000 for each trailer that they were contracted to build and send to New Orleans. So there was little effort to recoup the funding on the backs of the people who were suffering the most. Of course, when ICF's contract ended after 3 years, the subcontract was given then to Hammerman Gaynor Incorporated, both of which are subsidiaries of the Shaw Group. I focus in this book of mine on what I call the production of an affective surfeit, an excess of emotional trauma. I looked at the way people were asked to take on the burden of recovery on their own, generating over a long period of time a sustained emotional trauma that was devastating for most everyone and deadly for others. So these are the kinds of things that I documented as the human consequences of this arrangement of neoliberal recovery processes. And I call it an affective surfeit. I mean, I cried every time I went to an interview in this, and it was just overwhelming. I had to document that. I put that emotional experience down on paper somehow. What was clear is that while all of this was happening and there was this enormous collapse of sort of public safety net infrastructures to help people, volunteers came to New Orleans and started to do almost all the work on their own. Faith-based groups were at the, faith-based organizations and churches, both of them were at the sort of leading edge of this recovery and volunteer effort. St. Paul's Homecoming Center was the one I was most intimately involved with. Other groups like Rebuilding Together, most of which have a faith-based background of some sort. Of all of the accounting of how much money and volunteer effort was made in New Orleans, the top 6 or 7 of 10 were either faith-based or church organizations. So, people came from all over the country at their own expense, oftentimes to, and through their churches to help clean up yards. The Good News Camp was a camp that spontaneously formed and set itself up in City Park in New Orleans. It was actually organized by Jerry Davis Ministries, a Christian group. And these are the people who got everyone back into their homes. The St. Paul's Homecoming Center got this woman back into her home in year 6 after the recovery, after fundraisers where people would shout things like, "Screw the government, we'll do it ourselves," sort of engaging in an interesting concealment of the process of subcontracting that was going on. And she said after 2 years and 800 volunteers, they were able to get her back in her home. So people who were still in their trailers. So what I look at is how in the absence of effectively delivered structural support that was organized privately with government resources for-profit efforts, and that allowed these private sector companies to really profit on the disaster, residents of New Orleans had to rely on each other and on the steady stream of largely faith-based volunteer charity sector support and work. These sources of relief, I argue, operate through the generation of both unpaid labor and through the generation of affect. Affect here is the emotional sense of urgency tied to tragic situations that come with an injunction to action. Affect here commands a sense of purpose and ethical goodness from those who volunteer and a sense of restored faith in society on the part of those who receive. Faith-based institutions that work largely through the circulation of this type of affect now, more than ever, fill in the gaps left open by the failure of both the private sector insurance companies and what Margaret Summers calls the market-driven governance that was organized to help rebuild New Orleans. This, of course, began before Bush with Clinton's charitable choice option that was put forward, but it really achieved fruition with George Bush Sr., who called for 1,000 points of light, as you recall, from churches and charities across the country to fill in the gaps created by a failed economy. Over the past 20 years, the churches have grown in size and influence in this process. And so now what we see are the formation of new assemblages that have things like the Points of Light Institute, the first big public-private initiative to get churches more involved in filling in and providing for the safety net. And since then, federal support for these programs has grown. Under George W. Bush, the birth of the Corporation for National and Community Service as a government funder of these efforts, not even trying to conceal that it's a it's a corporation, right? But it's a government-run corporation. New large NGOs are emerging in this interstitial space between federal government and local faith-based or volunteer movements. The Hands-On Network is one of these. It's the biggest one, and through its annual conference in New Orleans this last summer, they mobilized lots of volunteers, 30.4 million volunteers since they started. They equate that to $615 million in human capital. Other clearinghouses are emerging and have been around for a decade or so now, 2 decades. AmeriCorps, under that, Community Health Corps, the Teach for America group. One of the interesting new twists in this arrangement that I found out about through the work in New Orleans is the return of subcontracting companies who now see the potential for profit in this area. So our ICF returns again. It is connecting. So they basically, ICF merged itself with a company called Macro International, which, as you can read here, the CEO of ICF, Macro now, is focusing on the health, human services, and social programs, focusing in particular on faith-based community volunteer groups, which they're now getting government funding to run. So they're profiting twice on the disaster. First on their failure, on the profit making that was going on when they delivered aid and didn't deliver it successfully, and now on this second time around when the faith-based groups have come in to do it, they're capitalizing again on it. So these new assemblages that connect corporate profits to volunteer and faith-based labor sectors involve what I call an affect economy and generate what Ananya Roy has called sort of the double bottom line of profits that are social and monetary at the same time. And they involve mechanisms like philanthrocapitalism and venture philanthropy, which blur that distinction even more. And just to have allowed for this large movement of the market into, and the erasure really of a version of the public sector that's protected as a public space and allowed the market to sort of determine how much is needed and how much is given. It hasn't disappeared the public sector. It's just put the public sector's resources to through a different funnel of operations that allow people to profit on them in new ways. But one of the interesting things about it that I am focused on is that it requires kind of the production of ongoing need that this economy does. There are also a lot of political windfalls from this. So one of the things I've written about is the other road to serfdom. With the calls for ending big government, there's fear that Obama's going to drive us down into serfdom again. That one of the things that I'm trying to talk about is the way that the shifting of our major safety net work to the unpaid sector is really problematic. So I have some themes that I would generate, or I would like to contribute here. One is this affect economy, the emotional surfeit produced by failed prolonged recovery, not just from disasters, by the response to them, and the way this is tapped into by organizations that have grown in the NGO subsector to generate volunteer labor, the unpaid labor force that's now in existence, and the profit making that helps on this. I had a student come and shadow me the other day who was from the Health Corps, and she told me this interesting story about her first day on the job when they were training her. They told her she gets paid $900. She's a volunteer, which means she gets a $900 stipend a month to work full-time for community health outreach programs in Ukiah. And they told her on her first day there that she could use some of her paid time to go and apply for food stamps. So, I mean, it's an interesting new arrangement of low-paid labor to fill in the gaps. And I think we need to explore the shifting infrastructures of caregiving and the important task of accounting for the outcomes of these shifts in ways that are realistic and critical. I also think the role of the market and the charity sector needs real scrutiny around whether it's profiting on charity or putting capital to good use, and the reproduction of need as both a product and a target in this economy. And then the quality of faith, that because faith plays such a big part of this, who pays for this work and what is the gain for those involved? What is the conversion potential and what exclusions are aroused by that? And there are some good books out there on the role of churches in the safety net, some really good books, and I'm really a newcomer to it, so I probably would just defer to those refer to those books if anybody wants to talk about them more. But, there's a long history of the church's role in this capacity in the US. And then finally, the sort of types of labor that we're talking about here in the volunteer sector. Those who get stipends and food stamps, those who do volunteerism, which basically pay to go work in places, and then the idea of compassion capital that is generated out of this. So that was,
That's great. Thank you very
That
much. Oh,
was
darn. I was going to write them down. But that's
I've got them here if you want to. Thanks.
Why don't you just take over, Julia?
Sure. Here, let me grab
Yeah.
So I'm violating every protocol of my discipline by not having a PowerPoint with images to show you, so I apologize for that. I'm just going to sketch out really pretty briefly a sort of intellectual genealogy of my interest in artistic labor, which is sort of the overarching rubric in which all of my work fits. My first book, Art Workers, which has a, I think, still extremely boring title, but it is descriptive about a group of artists who decided to self-identify as workers, actually as art workers. And this is a group that came together in 1969 in New York. They tried to even form a sort of proto-union around the quite oxymoronic idea of art as a form of work. And of course, there is no employer there. There is no organizing body from which they can do things like exact wages or go on strike, et cetera. And that sort of paradox fueled my interest in this group. And they only lasted a few short years, but some of the most important figures in late 20th century art were affiliated with this organization. And I look at how this identification of themselves as art workers had profound impacts on their own art practice. So the minimal art of Carl Andre, the conceptual work of Hans Haacke, and the feminist criticism of someone like Lucy Lippard. And one of the things I was interested in thinking through was how the dematerialization of art in the late 1960s, so the turn to conceptualism and factory fabrication, a kind of outsourcing of artistic making, paralleled in some ways or had some resonance with what Marcuse called the dematerialization of labor, or the turn to what we could call a kind of post-industrial service economy. So as I was working through that book, I obviously was thinking a lot about how art has often been seen by many theorists in opposition to work, as it's kind of outside, or it's the liberating other from the sort of deadening effects of capitalist wage labor. And I was thinking about how if art is a kind of ostensible opposite of work, and of course it's not, they're co-constructed terms, another sort of, a third term in that rubric might be craft, and often, of course, craft, which is seen as utilitarian or decorative or low, is contrasted to art in some interesting ways, and also exists in tension then with questions of work. So my new project, and I'm determined to have a sexier title this time, I've actually changed it. It's not Crafting Dissent anymore, but Crisis Craft is the new title, is actually about the last 4 decades or so, but actually going all the way back to the late 19th century to William Morris, and thinking about how craft and handmaking is often recruited in times of economic upheaval and also in times of national trauma. So I'm thinking about anti-sweatshop organizers who also have hobbyist craft practices and organize hobby crafters around the world, you know, in order to send knitted petitions about Nike sweatshop labor, for example, to Phil Knight. The artists who are working with the maquiladoras on the border, you know, especially in Texas, on the border between the US and Mexico, working with women who work in factories to make hand-produced objects. Of course, artists very interested, these crafting artists, very interested in how, again, this sort of ostensible opposite of sort of mass production versus handmaking is constantly collapsing. So, you know, there's this often cited statistic that every pair of Nike sneakers takes 200 pairs of hands to assemble. So what we think of as sort of factory made is, of course, a different version of handmaking. And I'm interested in thinking about how artists, current artists, or artists sort of since 1970, since a sort of shift in the economy, have been trying to think critically in some ways about the utopian rhetoric around handmaking and trying to dismantle that. And of course, this goes back, this is a kind of haunting of the legacy of William Morris, who saw a great deal of potential in terms of the kind of overthrow of capitalist systems with a return to kind of honest, valuable, skilled handiwork. So some of the other things I'm interested in crisis craft are works that are probably familiar to you, like the AIDS quilt, as a response to the crisis, of course, of HIV/AIDS and why that took textile form, how that textile is now under a great deal of pressure and duress. It's actually disintegrating in a warehouse in Atlanta, Georgia. So the problem with conservation with these materials that are inherently somewhat fragile, it's a very different kind of work, and constantly under threat of decay. I'm also working on these small burlap wall hangings that were made by Chilean housewives in the first few years of the Pinochet era as a way of working through their own grief and also a document of protest for their husbands or sons who were disappeared. So these are some of the kind of case studies that are I'm collecting in a constellation of work that I'm calling Crisis Craft, and it obviously is deeply interested still in questions of what it means to work and have that work sometimes go unpaid because much art is not paid under in the same kind of market economy of wage labor. And some of it isn't paid at all. Some of it actually has a kind of, what is the question? The word is sometimes used, the gift. What is the gift of the art in these new forms of economic transition? So I wanted to keep it really brief because I know we have so many people. So maybe I'll just end it there and we can talk more during the discussion.
Thank you.
Oh.
Hi, everyone. I'm getting over a cold, so if my voice is not loud enough, I'll try and speak up, but I apologize. I'm a little, as I'm sure you can hear. It's really nice to see everyone, meet new people. It's especially nice to see Jennifer, my old homegirl from the block. How you been? You been okay? I'm going to talk less about my own work in what I've been sort of working through, in part because I think I have a less clear account than Julia about the relationship between art and labor. That's something I'm still puzzling through. And I sort of just want to make some remarks directly to this symposium and this grant and the future of it, and sort of some framing remarks. I mean, I think the phrase that changing conceptions of work implies a certain, obviously it has a distance or a slippage in it between actual changes and our conceptions of them. And I sort of want to start in that gap, particularly as it relates to the situation in the humanities, which necessarily has its own doubleness, shifting between actual labor conditions that we inhabit in the humanities and how the humanities thinks about work. Obviously, that's too much to cover in 9 minutes. So really, I'm trying to just want to make a couple summary remarks in hopes they can provide part of the frame for this unfolding project. And I really meant to just write down 4 bullet points and freestyle around them, but that caused me so much anxiety that I wrote out. You always think you're going to write the bullet points and you start writing phrases, and then you have to read the phrases. So here I am. I'm just going to read and try and look up occasionally as if I'm thinking. My first remark is that we're seeing a somewhat curious reversal. My we in this case refers to the folks in the discourse sphere of the humanities as centered around prestigious US universities. Usually conceptions trail behind actual changes by between roughly a week and a couple centuries. We are in some regards seeing that now, but this lag is also appearing as its opposite. Conceptions have in some regard been running ahead of conditions. There's been great attention paid to the shocking developments in the situation of work here in the UCs, in the university system over the last 3 or 4 years. Though as soon as we started running numbers, we discovered that these changes toward precarious labor, decrease in benefits, shifting balance between managers and managed, and so forth. We discovered these changes have been going on since before the crisis, though they have intensified in some regards since then. This is a way our conceptions were a little behind. But in trying to understand and account for and dramatize these changes, we have perhaps gotten ahead of ourselves. For in a real sense, they aren't changes at all. That is, they are rather rote executions of the neoliberal post-Fordist program of enterprise restructuring. In their structural logic, in fact, they aren't very interesting, much less shocking. They're on the verge of automatistic. Indeed, the only mildly surprising element has been the delay in their arrival at the university, which we can explain via the adequate model by the fact that universities aren't directly productive businesses, much like the military. They're in what's called Department 3, providing neither consumer commodities nor inputs for manufacture. And unsurprisingly, the restructuring of the university has happened at about the same time and along similar schedule as the same restructuring of the military, the so-called RMA, the Revolution in Military Affairs. So we have this funny sort of fixation on the vagaries and the nuances and the supposedly telling details of this, in fact, rather crude and already very well-studied set of changes that's happening in the university. Our fascination has involved, I admit, a bit of credulity. In my own department, about 3 years ago, a dean came to us to explain that the university would be moving to have more of the department's core courses taught by latter faculty, and to shift work away from lecturers and adjuncts. In the end, to shift it away from that sector almost entirely. Now, anyone who had been paying attention would have been quite perplexed by this claim, because every other restructuring maneuver had followed the post-Fordist playbook precisely. Indeed, the existence of this dean at our departmental meeting was part of such developments. And sure enough, we haven't seen anything of this shift of core courses to latter faculty, except insofar as there has been a relative shift in total number of courses to total number of teachers. That's merely a measure of contraction, not of a change in division of labor. Indeed, we have seen just the opposite of what the dean suggested. We have seen a continued rise in the percentage of courses taught by precarious labor. This is what I mean in referring to the risks of obsessing over the changes, their scope and complexity and nuance. One would have done much better in assessing and predicting the actual changes to work in the humanities in the last 4 or 10 or 15 years by ignoring any discourse, any rhetoric, any seemingly exceptional details, and just reading a basic manual on Toyotaization and assuming it would go down like that. But this is what we might call an occupational hazard, especially in English departments, but in the humanities in general. We read discourse, we read rhetoric, and moreover, we read these things for their inconsistencies, incoherences, exceptions. This is particularly true regarding the high prestige theories of the last 40 years, which is coincidentally the era of post-Fordism. We read exceptional details and we win by having a more nuanced version of the situation than the next person, the next teacher, the next job candidate, the next student. And this leads to a particular danger for any discipline, I think, which is that of looking for your keys under the streetlights. I think the humanities, in conceptualizing work and its own situation, have fallen prey to this risk in several regards. A useful example is the recent attention to the category of immaterial labor, and particularly on knowledge work and the cognitariat and so forth. These are really significant categories. I'm fascinated in this work. I think it's important to think about. I think it has extremely crucial histories, especially of thinking of matters like unpaid women's work and the question of the wages for housework and things like this. However, I also think it's problematic when you discover that the new truth of work looks just like you, which is what professors are inclined to do over and over again. And we see certain kinds of overvaluing of changes in a global labor situation, which sort of revolve around this fascination that the situation might be more and more like us. There's a more domestic example of this habit, which is the ineradicable, seemingly, fantasy that we can save, or at least slow the annihilation of our departments and disciplines by articulating the mission of the humanities in some better way, so that people will understand, oh my goodness, I've lost my page, so that people will understand its relative importance and endorse it and fund it. We see calls to articulate the mission of the humanities at this point roughly every few minutes. There's probably no better example of searching for your car keys under the streetlight, though it would be easy to name others. We are, after all, paid articulators. The very existence of our jobs rests on the axiomatic faith that articulating a situation can have material consequences. And I think there are historical situations where this has been true, when the material situation was such that a well-argued case could have a real seeming of achieving such ends. We're not in that situation presently. Neo-Keynesian economics has this idea of a zero lower bound. Those of you who are readers of Krugman's column will be deeply familiar with this concept, since it's essentially his one concept. Normally, monetary policy in this account can affect inflation and unemployment, which is the entirety of its mandate, by raising or lowering interest rates. But at the zero lower bound, also known as a liquidity trap, crisis drives capital into bond markets, which drives down interest rates until they reach a real rate of zero. At this point, because monetary policy can no longer choose which direction to adjust, it loses traction. What I want to suggest, finally, is that we are at the zero lower bound of discourse. It's not interest rates, but it is rates of accumulation, social surplus, material conditions. There may be situations in which those things are tractable by discourse, but as they incline toward the zero lower bound, discourse loses its traction altogether, and rhetoric, and articulation. In this situation, different responses are called for. Indeed, in such situations, continuing to pursue a politics of articulation means not merely to look like you're searching for your car keys under the streetlight, but like a desperate and narrow attempt to preserve a last small stronghold of discourse and articulation and position taking, buttressed and dug in to not change one's most crucial conceptions of work, as the world outside changes radically and catastrophically. This won't do, and it won't work. So I think when we talk about the changing conceptions of work, both within and without the humanities, both how it is and how we think about it, we need in this moment to move away from the streetlight, move away from discursive activities, and realize and support and commit to other kinds of actions if we want to have some say in what work looks like at all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm Shannon Jackson. Just because a couple of other people said something about their own work, I'll quickly say that that though Celeste was right in saying that we're maybe more of a 21st century group, my first book did look at something called the settlement movement, which is a movement of the progressive era, 19th century to early 20th century reform movement, where I was interested in tracking the work of volunteer, we would call them now volunteer, middle class and upper class women and later men who end up forming a social movement that seeks to do something more structurally transformative than a charity model, and is working at a time when so many of the issues that we see sort of coming to the fore in different ways received public sector structural engagement. Really from people who started out in a kind of Republican conservative orientation toward thinking about how local personal relationships change everything, to realizing that actually sort of a wider structural engagement was necessary around things around like public housing, immigration reform, labor reform, all of the things that that progressive era is often credited in the United States for thinking through so many of the issues that concern us now, and for installing the beginnings of structures around social welfare, juvenile justice, et cetera, that we see dismantled now. And I was interested in the role of the arts and performance in that social reform movement, which ends up, I think, informing the way that I think about contemporary art workers now, who are also engaged, working in cross-disciplinary forms that seek some kind of social engagement, but where the nature of what that social is in social engagement is itself debated territory. And within that, I think my own little beef within that was concerned about a certain kind of activist, of a certain kind of way of framing politicized art practice as as about breaking down the system, dismantling the system, about a certain kind of artistic resistant act that was sometimes a kind of in a sort of inertia anti-statist. Let's get the machine off our backs, and that's how we know we're being activist artists. And I was concerned about the routinization of that in a situation where institutions and state systems are actually being dismantled, and to try to think more about what social engagement might mean for artists who are might be interested in the repair of those institutions and repair of public sector operations, however constraining we understand them to be. They also sustain us. So that's probably informs that, and the fact that I'm in the rhetoric department, the performance studies department, and now run this arts research center, what is about creating collaborations across disciplines, probably informs what I was going to say. But I took Celeste fairly seriously, who gave us a directive at one point to talk about 5 questions that are most important in the fields that you seem to represent. And so what I thought I'd do is I'll talk about 5 things, 5 sort of terms. 1, creativity; 1, precarity; a 3rd, affective labor. I'll say something quickly about humanists as workers, and then go end with something like cross-sector collaboration. So those are sort of 5 areas that I think of as dominating my life at the current moment. So one thing, it seems to me, in thinking about what the future of this working group would be, especially from somebody coming from an arts and humanities sector, is about the dominance of a discourse of creativity that sort of circulates, that has a very strong popular lay circulation at the moment, with books like Daniel Pink telling us why right-brainers are going to rule the world, or works like Richard Florida's The Creative Class, talking about how a certain very, very, very loose and varied assembly of creative people are essential for the vitalization of our cities. And a number of people, of course, have tracked the what is really a sort of mixed bag rhetorically about how the discourse of creativity seems to, in many ways, support so much of the kinds of skills and values that those in the arts and humanities and varied elements in the social sciences would seem to support. Critical thinking, innovation, imagination, working in groups, and at the same time, the ways in which those same discourses ultimately are contained and instrumentalized, so that when Daniel Pink says the MFA is the new MBA, we can be like, oh, yay! But it is, I think, a discourse that is that is dominant, and that I feel that to some degree we're occasionally asked to make ourselves accountable to. It's one that I think is appropriate to encounter with suspicion, and at the same time I do wonder about alternate ways of deploying it, and to think more about how that might be. Some of the as those I like this reader called, it's a My Creativity Reader, which is sort of a counter-creativity reader that is one of the places that has sort of interrogated this concept. And one of the concerns there, and it's been a concern in thinking about artists and culture workers now, is the ways in which is how much the creative discourse focuses on the vitalization of, say, economic sectors without necessarily focusing on the vitalization and capacities to sustain the people who are creative, the individuals who are made responsible for vitalizing communities. And coming from an arts perspective, especially artists in the United States, which have been such a precarious sector, the sort of wild irony of the artists being charged with vitalizing precarious communities when they themselves are a demographic so precarious is a bit ironic. That has been a focus of some of the counter-creativity critique that at the same time is seeking to figure out different ways to deploy the discourse. We've been working at ARC in San Francisco right now with an initiative in the Central Market District of San Francisco that is a whole another mixed bag of uses of that creativity discourse to think about the redefining and figuring out alternate ways of sustaining this particular neighborhood within San Francisco. And it has all of the earmarks of the perils and potentials of a richer Florida model with tech people interacting with chefs, interacting with artists, interacting with social service organizations, and trying to figure out how to sort of build coalition and at the same time to reckoning with the fact that they may have very different goals about what success or vitalization or creativity might be. So precarity is another word that obviously has also come up quite a bit. I've been interested, within performance studies and within the arts. That's a term that is getting a lot of play right now, even in in mainstream press. I've been thinking about it as I've been influenced a lot by Ulrich Beck's work on the risk society, thinking in particular about how the language of risk is a language that's celebrated, especially in situations where we're talking about the capacity for individuals to lead flexible lives, to form, as he says, do-it-yourself biographies and have the sort of privilege of not being tied down, which at the same time, the flip side of that, of course, is not being tied down means also not having the systems of security that maintain a life that can't necessarily where certain kinds of systemic problems can't necessarily be managed by through certain kinds of personal choice. And that the particular way that the precarity discourse also interacts with a discourse that values flexibility and risk, even as it also sort of sidelines the dangers inherent in this celebration has been a concern to me. I think that I think within the critical humanities, just thinking about my 90s graduate school education in critical theory, and there's a particular way that I think the rise of the term precarity. I find it interesting to think back to the earlier terms that were in circulation so often in the critical humanities, words like nomad, resistance, etc., where a certain kind of individuated, can't tie me down subjectivity was celebrated. That where we really saw, and there were important complicated arguments, that there was resistant potential in this figure. And at the same time, I think that the reductive readings of that weren't necessarily preparing us for, again, this sort of flip side of the nomadic subject who then also doesn't have healthcare, the nomadic subject who doesn't, withdraws from certain kinds of collective models of social care. So I am sometimes interested in how we reckon a certain kind of discourse within the critical humanities that has valued agency only, as I said earlier, when it's disrupting system, or valued subjects that can't, that are experimental, free, and flexible, and then how we can square that with the equally urgent sense that we might need structures that tie us down long enough to make commitments to each other and to future generations. Affective labor is, of course, a term. It's already, the affective term has come up already. The affective labor term has been a key one in artist circles for thinking about who have reheard some of the Hart and Negri and Paolo Verno arguments from the post-operaista Marxism to think about what it means to be turning to a service economy. And I think that there's, again, one of those mixed bags here that on some level, artists, those of us in performance, are often might already have had something, knew a little something about a service economy or about an experience economy. Is there an opportunity here for thinking differently about what that turn is, even as again, the questions, the concerns around instrumentalization continue to, raise their heads at every turn. Quickly, I'll just put out there that when it comes to something around humanists as workers, a whole other element that has been bothering me of late is how we think about the production of humanities scholarship, whether or not the book-based disciplines should remain book-based. That could be a component of what we might be thinking about. And finally, the perils and potentials of cross-sector collaboration. It seems to me that often the humanities has positioned itself as a kind of a critical force that is where the advancement of our own careers is tied to the degree to which we can find the problematic thing, pull the rug out from under the practices of sectors with which we're not allied in the arts, in social services, in education outside of higher education. And so whether or not we can reconfigure that role, remain critical, but also consider the degree to which educational sectors, social service sectors, cultural sectors are imperiled together, and that we might find alternate ways of allying ourselves with each other that probably change what we think a humanist worker is as well. Okay, thank you.
Steve. Okay. I don't know. I don't really need the mic. It's a small enough group, I think. For the recording. For the recording? Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for inviting me and really us. I'm representing, coming from UC Santa Cruz, where our Center for Labor Studies is based in the humanities, part because it was started in 2007 by Dana Frank, who's a historian, and in their histories in the humanities. So we've had a few years where we've been running under the Miguel Contreras Fund, the Center for Labor Studies. Unfortunately, our funding is running out. But the campus is made up with, there's people across the disciplines who work on labor. And so I'm going to be more representing other folks who are looking for collaborative possibilities and throw out a few ideas. We had a meeting last week of some folks who wanted to look for possible connections. And I think they're on a lot of topics that came up across some of these, affective labor, others. My own background, I'm a sociologist and I study work, and I'm an ethnographer. So when I look at this call, it's really as conceptions of work, is whose conceptions of work are we looking at? And I thought one of the interesting things is we haven't heard very much, except for artists, whose conceptions of work. And so for someone who studied first looking at women workers who do assembly work and why the way they came to work in the Philippines in assembly was this was a really good job. And so for them, it wasn't exploitative work, but actually empowering work, which allows the reproduction of these very unequal exploitative conditions. My second project has been on Filipino seafarers in the global labor market. Here again, we see a mobility for one group is actually reproducing inequality in a larger scale. So my interest in possibly putting together a project here is looking at this idea of changing conceptions of work, of workers. And in this case, looking possibly to narrow that, to look at how immigrant workers conceive of work and how that's changed over time. What's the expectation of immigrants who come, say, California? The limit I haven't set yet. I initially thought for this to look at Asian immigrant labor in California. Changing conceptions of them. Here we look at early Indian, Japanese, Filipino labor, Japanese labor who come mainly in agriculture. And now we look at the conception both of Asians coming to work in California, very different occupations, very different groups, but we can look at this idea of how our conceptions of labor has changed as much as the conceptions of these workers have changed toward work and what's expected. So that's one idea that we're thinking about and looking for possible collaborators who might be looking at historically looking at possibly the history of sort of immigrant workers in California, for example, and how they conceive of work. With the sort of, as a sociologist, more contemporary ethnography sort of take on what are conceptions of work now. Another project that's somewhat related was brought up by a colleague of mine, Eva Bertram, who's in the politics department, was there was some mention that Theo Gobler talked about the when work disappears, and this is a good moment to rethink work. Well, 1973, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare put out a book called Work in America. It later became a book. And it really was, what does work mean? And this is coming in, Braverman's writing about sort of work, Studs Terkel's kind of work, and that sort of this idea. And so it's coming right when things are changing, right, in 73. Just when, and so what's interesting for Eva's thinking about this is a 40-year retrospective on what does work mean, re-looking at some of these documents for the discourse and the meanings of work that are assumed, what we should expect, what we deserve as workers, versus what something like that now is. And that might be this play on sort of being self-employed, being entrepreneurial, that kind of assumptions behind the discourse of what is really precarious work now, and what people assumed was possible. So Eva was thinking about possibly looking at this, re-looking at the work in America, both as text, but also what does it work in terms, what does it mean in terms of what workers really can expect from the public sector, from private sector employers, etc. The third area that Santa Cruz is sort of done work on, and where we have folks working on, is in the area of sort of agriculture and food. And so one of the things we're doing later this year, we have a conference on February 4th, Laboring Across the Food System, which is Mary Beth Putta, who wanted to come today, in Community Studies, and Julie Guthman are putting together as part of a conference for the Center for Labor Studies, is really to look at labor from farm to fork, really looking at agricultural labor, food processing labor, retail, and restaurant work. And to look at sort of, and there's a lot of unpaid work across all these sectors to look at that. But, you know, in the food movement, there's so much about sort of justice and, you know, locality and things like that. What's missing often is the labor part of that. So some of the folks who are working on that conference are also interested, we also house in our Humanities Center the multi-campus research program, Studies of Food in the Body. So Julie Guthman is interested in possibly putting together something on looking at, her new book is out, but looking at food and labor and unpaid labor, different ways that comes together. So, so those are the sort of three large areas. Christine Hong is also in English, I believe, and interested possibly in looking at sort of this through sort of meanings in the humanities. So there are folks in sort of literature who are interested in possible connecting. So again, folks who are interested in making connections, I wanted to make sure their name comes up. And then the arts, L.S. Kim is in film and digital media, has been working on the image of the domestic, particularly looking at Asian domestics, and that is also interested in possibly looking at sort of these sort of images of workers as much across time. So I'm going to hold it there, and really, please, the folks from Santa Cruz, I was the only one able to make it this time, but a number of people there are interested in possibly making connections. So hopefully through me, or I mentioned to folks there that I think there's going to be a network online where we can post things, so
Absolutely.
They'll be looking for
that. Jennifer Langen will talk about that after our brief lunch break. But before we get to our lunch break, thank you very much, Stevie. Last but not least, Richard Walker.
Thanks, Celeste. I'm disappointed that you in humanities go alphabetically.
The
in social sciences would have counted numbers of letters. So here I am thrown back to my childhood being last. Oh, sorry about that. Anyway, I'm out of the social sciences. I get to come over to the Townsend, which I regard as this kind of little oasis here from time to time. They reach out and bless me, and I get to come over and eat there. They sit in this beautiful room. Because we don't have a center like this in social sciences, which is a great shame. So I took Celeste at her word, and I did try to come up under the idea of conceptions of work and cultures of work with 4 ideas. Unlike Shannon, I wasn't able to come up with 5, I'm sorry, but they have sub-ideas, so it'll actually be more than that. So the first thing, and these all come out of what I do, what I teach, what I think about a lot in economic geography, as a Marxist, political economist, and so on. and as an urbanist. So first of all, first thing that's interesting is the general devaluation of work in a capitalist society. I'm just teaching, as I often do, reading Marx's Capital. And by the way, I have a heck of a lot of humanities students there, so watch out. And the whole ideology of capitalism is to devalue work as the source of human, as a kind of essential human activity, as the source of surplus. The capital is the value producer. Capitalists are productive. Capitalists are the job creators. You know, every generation has a new version of this, of the same crop. And, you know, but the cultural devaluation of labor in general and of the working class in general is interesting. And it's very extensive in the United States. We don't even talk about a working class, unlike some countries. We're only middle class. And even, you know, pretty radical people still talk about the middle class because that's the coin of the realm. I mean, there's nobody. There's just the rich, the poor, and the middle class. And nobody actually works. And, of course, you can extend that, these people who don't count, to, you know, the traditional devaluation of women and women's work, of people of color and their work, and so on. And then in the neoliberal era, all this has gotten much worse, as people pointed out. But I would like to say that this is a very old problem. And it only got worse with flexibilization and precarious labor, the stagnation of wages amongst ordinary working class people over the last 40 years. A lot of people like to take it back to Reagan. It actually goes back to the early 70s. The union busting, the vast instability with all the decennial recessions we have. It's really been a horrible time for ordinary workers. And that makes us devalue them even more. And we should talk about how we naturalize that. You know, oh, well, you know, people are used to being precarious labor, therefore they don't, you know, they're risky. Maybe they don't mind risk, or they learn to live with it because that's just their character and so on. So, you know, I just don't think you can get away from that massive devaluation of work. Secondly, what's probably more prominent in our time is the specific devaluation of unskilled labor versus skilled labor. And people have touched on this already. But what we get is this idea, very popular today, about the creative class. Richard Flord, by the way, is an old friend of mine, although I never see him anymore. He's way out of my league now. From conferences on economic geography. We were economic geographers together. But there's Bob Reich, who I also really like and admire, but he wrote this book 20 years ago where he talked about we're all symbolic analysts now. There's the older human capital theory. That's really ironic that your labor is now capital, which is both true, as Marx would say, and completely untrue, and so on. And those are, as Joshua was saying, people like us. And so there's tend to, and Shannon also, exaggerate the importance of these people, that they're the only one who create value. They're the only ones whose labors count. They're the innovators. They're the creators. And everybody else is just a schlump who doesn't really count. So there's a massive devaluation of manual labor in favor of mental labor. And this is also much older, the white-collar, blue-collar kind of split. And yet, an awful lot of white-collar labor is done under incredibly poor conditions. It's not symbolic at all. It's office work. You know, it's office space. One of my great films of our time is,
Best thing we've ever made. Top 10.
Yeah, I put it right up there with Chinatown. And then, you know, that raises some interesting political questions, too, or larger questions about what this does politically and to society. There's, on the one hand, the kind of Mozart effect, I call it. Why does a society like Austria in the 18th century produce so many fantastic musicians? Because that's valued. What do we produce today? We produce nerds and bankers. And that's what all students want to be. And, you know, the nerd was Steve Jobs dying, of course. The nerd as hero is very much before us, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, except that it funnels so much talent into certain kinds of work so that everybody wants to create the next great app rather than write the next great book on Shakespeare or whatever it might be. And of course, in the case of bankers, do absolutely nothing of use and become social parasites through great creativity. Go back and read Michael Lewis's Liar's Poker. It's one of the great discussions of the uselessness of financial labor and who goes into it, the way people rush. You know, from Yale, you go to work on Wall Street. From Berkeley and Stanford, you go to work in Silicon Valley. The reverse, of course, is the Kansas effect, which is the resentment of those who are devalued and those who don't count and those who become confused. And the Republicans can play into, the right plays into this all the time. Who's the ruling class in America? Oh, it's those nerds on the coast. It's those bankers on the coast and their minions, rather than capitalists. And that's very popular. That's very profound, that we tend to think both those who love and hate the skilled elite, that they're the ones who really are the bearers of power, when actually they're not. They get paid well, they do a lot, but are they actually the ones in charge? And as we're discovering as university professors, we thought we were that too, but it doesn't look like it, does it, when you really when the rubber hits the road. The third point I want to make, which goes back to my book, The New Social Economy, Rethinking the Social Division of Labor, is the mystifications of the division of labor. And this is something that's fascinated me for a long time. Part of it has to do with what we call the service economy, which I've written about because it is one of the most abused concepts in economics, in all social theory, in popular discussions, business press, and so on. The service economy is now 90% of the economy, which means it's meaningless because it's everything. But we fall into that, and we tend to think that, for instance, healthcare must be service. But how much service do you get out? How much personal service is there in healthcare? Most of it's actually producing and peddling pills. Or people who are doing clerical work just to get you in there so that the nurse can actually look at you or the doctor can actually look at you. And in fact, overall, it was pointed out many years ago, we actually don't take our products as services. We mostly take our products as goods. Yes, we go to the coiffeur or something, but we actually buy tubes of paste that we stick on our head. And we love, all the software that we have access to today, but how do we get it? We buy an iPhone, we buy an iPad, which gives us all those wonderful things, but it still comes in a box. And somebody's making those boxes. And the people who are making those boxes are mostly in East Asia today or in China. There tend to be somebody else somewhere else. And of course, in economic geography, we're very interested in this question of the spatial division of labor. And it's kind of like Engels writ large. Engels said that the working class is out of mind because we don't see them in Manchester, the conditions of the working class. Nothing has changed. The working class and the poor and the suffering and the workers is usually put out of mind while the rich people go live in Pacific Heights or Marin, where there is no labor going on, except, of course, that very crucial element of domestic labor, which they don't treat in the same way at all as Rockaway and others have pointed out in talking about service work. So what you get is this couple of incredible delusions about work today. One is that we can all live on a service economy and that we don't actually have to produce anything. And this, the whole of American political and economic culture has bought this entirely, that manufacturing doesn't matter. It's just, whatever you do, we're just doing it. And actually being able to make things isn't important to power. But I can assure you, power or well-being or jobs or anything, and yet here comes China. And why is China rising? Because they're industrial, and they're the biggest industrial producer in the world today. Well, they're not actually, we are still, but they're creeping up very fast. So The left even falls into this, you know, dematerialization of labor and Marcuse. I never quite liked Marcuse that much, even as a student. When it's really stuff that's being produced somewhere else. And then we think there's not, you know, and then we think there's no manual labor left in the US. And yet you go to Silicon Valley, which is a place I study a lot, you got maybe 250,000 people working in electronics and 1 million people working, flipping hamburgers and driving trucks and stocking work. Even if you buy from China, you have to go through the port of LA with huge products that go in containers that are then disassembled in warehouses in Riverside, California. And everybody says, why is the Inland Empire growing? Because they have all these warehouses. You know, tens, hundreds of millions of square feet of warehouses. And we look out there and just say, well, it's just a bunch of houses, as if there was no work going on out there. And so on and so on. As if restaurants, what they do is serve you. You know, there's a person who serves you sometime. But if you go to fast food, there's no service at all. There's just a product that's being flipped in the back room. And we don't see that as manual labor. You know, there's massive amounts of manual labor. It has nothing to do with services. It's just food production, as our friends at Santa Cruz would know. And finally, my final point is, what also comes up as interesting is national cultures of work. And this was also, I think, Shannon mentioned this. That once the US started to be challenged by the 1980s, from Japan at that time mostly, there was suddenly an attention to what was called varieties of capitalism. And people started studying and writing books about, oh, you know, Japanese capitalism doesn't look like American. All capitalism isn't Americanism. You know, Coca-Cola is not everything. Even McDonald's looks different in China or India than it looks here, because it has to be adapted to national cultures of consumption and national cultures of prestige and la-di-da-di-da-di-da. But also there are national cultures of work, which matter. And I guess you raised it, I think Shannon raised it around immigrants. No, you raised it, Steve, I'm sorry, around immigrants. And this is really important, is the culture of work. I mean, Americans have a certain kind of view of work. One of the things we do that's very bizarre, if you look at all the work tables, despite the crappier and crappier conditions of work, we work harder and harder. You know, Juliet Shore's great calculations that Americans work on average 5 weeks longer per year than they did 40 years ago. And welcome to the great brave new world of neoliberalism and the end of work. On the other hand, you have things like Germans still have this craft tradition, which shows up in the way they deal with innovation. They don't sit around celebrating college-educated nerds who go to the cities to create apps the way we do. I mean, we have a whole culture around that. They just take these blue-collar workers who actually have representatives on the boards of the companies, and they make them better and better. And as a result, Germany is the biggest exporting country in the world, in case you thought it was China. What are they exporting? Fine machinery. And fine cars and fine whatever, but mostly machinery so that for other people's factories. How do they do it? They constantly upgrade work. There's a great book by Richard Bernanke, who was Bernanke, who was a student of Michael Burroway's here years and years ago, on the difference between British and German industrialization based on the different cultures of work and conceptions of work that working class people had and what they thought were their rights. Now, Americans, you know, what do we think are our rights at work? Take this job and shove it. Or like the guy at Permanente yesterday, when I really get sick of my work, I'll go shoot everybody. And that's, on that note, I'll shut up.